It's November 1325. A small group of armed men slip through the dark toward a public well just outside the walls of Bologna. No torches, no warning. They're not here for gold, they're not here for hostages, and they're not here to burn anything down. They stop at the well, reach in, and lift out one thing, a plain wooden bucket, the kind you'd use to haul water and nothing else. Then they walk straight back out the way they came. Word gets back to Bologna fast, and the city does not shrug it off. Bologna sends a formal demand across the border to Modena. Give it back. Modena's answer is basically a shrug and a smirk. Come and take it. So Bologna does. It marches out an army of more than 30,000 men to reclaim a bucket. By the time the fighting stops, somewhere around 2,000 people are dead over a piece of wood you'd use to pull water from a well. And here's the part almost nobody tells you. The bucket probably isn't even why the war started.
To understand how a bucket could nearly justify a war, you have to go back further than 1325, all the way to 1176, when Emperor Frederick Barbarossa was defeated at the Battle of Legnano by an alliance of northern Italian cities loyal to the Pope. That defeat split Italy into two long-running camps. Cities loyal to the Pope became known as Guelphs. Cities loyal to the Holy Roman Emperor became known as Ghibellines. Bologna was Guelph through and through. Modena was Ghibelline through and through. Bologna was also, by this point, one of the intellectual capitals of Europe, home to the oldest university on the continent, already almost 2.5 centuries old, with money, population, and a civic reputation it took very seriously. For the century and a half that followed Legnano, the Guelph and Ghibelline labels weren't abstract politics. They were an excuse for every border dispute in the region to turn into something closer to a blood feud. In 1296, Bologna invaded Modenese territory and seized two towns, Bazzano and Savigno, with the Pope's blessing. Modena never really let that go. Inside Modena itself, a succession crisis eventually put a nobleman from Mantua, Passerino Bonacolsi, in charge, ruling in the emperor's name, and more than willing to keep the fight with Bologna alive. By 1325, these were not two neighbors squabbling over a fence line. This was the local front line of a fight that had already been running for 150 years. And these were not distant enemies. Bologna and Modena sat close enough that an army could reach the other's walls within a couple of days, which only made every insult land harder. All it needed was a spark.
As the story usually gets told, that spark was the bucket. Modenese raiders slip into Bologna under cover of night, grab the bucket from a well just outside one of the city gates, and parade it back home like a trophy. Bologna, humiliated in front of every rival city watching, sends a formal message demanding it back. Modena refuses, flat out. Bologna raises an army and marches to settle it. 300 years later, an Italian poet named Alessandro Tassoni took that story and turned it into a mock heroic epic poem with a title that translates to The Stolen Bucket. That poem is the version of events that stuck in popular memory, retold in history books and travel guides ever since. Two proud cities, one wooden bucket, and a war. But that's only half the story. The most detailed account from the actual period comes from a Bolognese chronicler named Matteo Grifoni, who was essentially writing the news in real time, in a record historians now call the Conflictus Zappolini. And in his account, the bucket isn't the trigger at all. What actually happened is far less poetic. Modena's forces had seized a Bolognese castle called Monteveglio. Bologna moved to take it back and laid siege to it, bringing in allies from Florence and from towns across Romagna, turning a local property dispute into a full regional mobilization. Modena's allies rushed in to defend the castle. Congrande della Scala, the powerful lord of Verona, Azzone Visconti of Milan, backed by his own professional German mercenaries, and Rinaldo, the Marquis of Ferrara, bringing troops from Ferrara and Mantua. Congrande didn't stay for the actual fight, heading back to Verona beforehand and leaving Passerino Bonacolsi in command.
Things had already gotten serious enough that the Pope himself stepped in, not to make peace, but to escalate. He formally declared Bonacolsi a rebel against the church and granted anyone who could harm him the same spiritual reward normally reserved for crusaders. This was no longer a squabble over pride. It was being framed as a holy cause. Bologna, for its part, put a professional soldier for hire in charge of the campaign,
a condottiero named Malatesta, Lord of Rimini, proof that whatever this was to the people watching from outside, the city itself was taking it dead serious. Most historians now think the bucket wasn't stolen before any of this happened at all. It was taken after, as a trophy, almost an afterthought, once Modena had already won and wanted to rub it in. The legend just runs the timeline backward, because stealing a bucket and going to war over it makes a far better story than losing a border castle and getting mocked with a well bucket on the way out. Here's where it gets complicated. Whatever actually lit the fuse, the two armies met near a small village called Zappolino on November 15, 1325, as the sun was going down. On paper, the numbers should have made this an easy massacre in Bologna's favor. Bologna showed up with something like 30,000 foot soldiers, backed by a couple thousand cavalry, city militia, hastily armed, thrown together for the occasion. Modena had maybe 7,000 or 8,000 men total, but they were battle-hardened, reinforced with professional German soldiers sent by the emperor himself. Between the two sides, this counts as one of the largest pitched battles of the entire Guelph and Ghibelline wars. Tens of thousands of men mobilized, depending which version of the story you believe, over a captured castle and a missing bucket. That's not a fair fight on paper. It's a rout waiting to happen, just not in the direction anyone expected. The Bolognese held the higher ground, spread along a slope leading down from the fortress they'd been besieging. The Modenese formed up on the flatter ground below them. Modena's commander, Passerino Bonacolsi, staged a fake river crossing the day before the real battle, drawing part of Bologna's forces away to chase a threat that wasn't real. When the actual attack came the next evening, Bologna's huge militia was tired, scattered, and only half in position, still recalling the men who'd gone off chasing shadows. Modena's smaller, disciplined force hit the weak point in the line hard, then swung cavalry around behind the Bolognese ranks. Within a couple of hours, in the fading light, Bologna's army broke completely and ran for the safety of the city walls. Roughly 2,000 men, from both sides combined, never made it home. Historians who study the period call it one of the bloodiest clashes of the entire Guelph and Ghibelline conflict, and one that changed almost nothing. And it might be the strangest part of all. Modena didn't even try to take the city. Instead, Modena's army marched right up to Bologna's gates, close enough to spit at the walls, and through what was essentially a party. They staged a mocking horse race just outside the city, loud and public, specifically so the whole humiliated population could watch from their own walls. On the way there, they burned or tore down several small castles belonging to Bologna. They dragged 26 captured Bolognian nobles back to Modena and held them prisoner for 11 weeks. And somewhere in that victory lap, they pulled a bucket out of a well near one of the city gates and carried it home like a war trophy, the way a modern rival might swipe a mascot after a blowout win. Back in Bologna, the shaken city hung the Pope's coat of arms alongside those of its allies, a reminder to itself more than anyone that it still had powerful friends, even after a defeat like this. Within a couple of months, a peace deal quietly handed the disputed castle of Monteveglio back to Bologna anyway, most likely bought back with a private ransom. Almost nothing on the map actually changed. Bologna got its land back. It never got the bucket back. To this day, it's still kept in Modena, guarded and displayed like a medal, not a piece of wood. Even the battlefield itself still exists, now a quiet village folded into the countryside of Emilia-Romagna, with one of the strangest wars in Italian history buried underneath it. There's one more piece. Why would an entire city send 30,000 men to fight over a border, a castle, and eventually a bucket, instead of just letting any of it go? In 1996, psychologists Dove Cohen and Richard Nisbett at the University of Michigan ran an experiment to find out what an insult actually does to a person, physically. They had a stranger bump into male students in a narrow hallway and call them a name, nothing more, then measured what happened in their bodies right afterward. In men raised around strong codes of honor and reputation, cortisol spiked, a sign of real physical stress. Testosterone spiked too, a sign their bodies were gearing up for a fight. Their brains lit up, primed for aggression, all from one shove and one word, while men raised somewhere else barely reacted at all. In a follow-up part of the same study, insulted men also walked further down a narrow hallway before stepping aside for an oncoming stranger. a small physical refusal to be the one who backs down first. It was published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and researchers have pointed to the same pattern again and again since. Cohen and Nisbet's explanation is that honor cultures tend to grow up in places where no outside authority reliably protects you, so your reputation for retaliation becomes your only real protection. Show any weakness, any willingness to yield, and you become a target. Medieval Italy, splintered between a distant pope and a distant emperor, with no real police force keeping order between rival cities, was exactly that kind of place, just scaled up to an entire city instead of one man in a hallway. Bologna could have simply paid for a new bucket and moved on.
That was never the option on the table. Bologna and Modena weren't fighting over water rights or a wooden pail. They were fighting over what it would mean, in front of every rival city watching, to be the one who backed down first. That's not a medieval quirk. That's a wiring diagram most of us are still carrying around. Somewhere in your own life, you've probably done a smaller version of this. Dug in over something tiny, because giving in felt like giving up something much bigger. Bologna never really needed that bucket back. It just couldn't be the city that let go first. Thanks for joining me on today's history. Subscribe and click on the screen to watch more interesting videos like this.